All right, so we've been keeping up with the ongoing conflict over in Israel, and I've been watching some of the mainstream press coverage of this issue. And if you know anything about the history of this and how the US media typically covers these things, it's almost always blanket defense for Israel and everything they do, usually not too sympathetic to the Palestinians in these situations. But this time, and I've been seeing a couple different interviews that have actually been really good, and this specific one that we're going to watch a couple clips from is involving this guy, Mohammed El-Kurd, and he is actually a resident in Sheikh Jarrah, which is one of these neighborhoods, which is in East Jerusalem, which these people are facing eviction. He is facing eviction from his home that his family has lived in for many years, and he gives a perfect description of what's going on the ground. And honestly, I don't know how the fuck they let this guy on CNN, because a lot of the stuff that he says here is really contentious for a typical mainstream audience to hear, but nonetheless, he's 100% right, and everything he says in this clip is accurate, and it's important for people to be able to confront this here in the United States, because this is the type of shit that we're supporting. So let's go ahead and hear what he's got to say with his first-hand testimony on the ground.
Quote, "They're coming to finish what they started." Well, Mohammed El-Kurd joins me now from Sheikh Jarrah. Thank you very much for joining us. You grew up in the neighborhood. Your family home is slated for eviction. What is the scene right now?
Well, I thank you so much for having me. To start, it's not really an eviction. It's forced ethnic displacement, to be accurate, because an eviction implies legal authority. While the Israeli occupation has no legitimate jurisdiction over the eastern parts of occupied Jerusalem under international law, it also implies the presence of a landlord, and certainly these Israeli settlers have not built our homes. They're not our landlords. They don't own our land. And thirdly, eviction does not imply the hundreds and hundreds of heavily armed police and army and settlers colluding, blowing up your doors, throwing your children from your windows, and using brute force to throw you out in the street and assaulting and arrest you should you resist. It doesn't imply the grenades. It doesn't imply the rubber-coated bullets. It's not an eviction. According to the UN and countless politicians and human rights organizations, it could amount to war crimes. Actually, the situation is pretty tense, I can tell you, and we're very scared of losing our homes to Israeli settler organizations.
These settlers and courts would argue that their claims to the land predates you and your family. Have you been allowed to prove otherwise?
No, the Israeli occupation courts take their documents without verification, without authentication or challenge, whereas our documents will not be looked at. They will not be taken into consideration. Besides, just because something is technically legal does not mean it's ethical or moral or historically just or accurate or correct. We've seen many systems exploit the law and exploit the judiciary to uphold supremacist and racist lives.
You've written...
Right, so he continues on. I'm going to play another clip here, but everything that he just said was an accurate characterization of the current situation, right? These are illegal actions under international law, and multiple organizations have come out and said that they could amount to war crimes. And so, you know, this is a situation where the United States has an extraordinary amount of leverage over Israel. Obviously, we give them billions of dollars in military aid every single year. And these are the types of things that they're doing on the ground. They're displacing people from their homes who, again, have lived there for many decades. And this is illegal. East Jerusalem is not supposed to be under Israeli occupation. It has been for decades. It's not recognized by the international community as being part of Israel, and yet they're treating it like that, and they are continuing these settlements and violently displacing people from their homes. And so he continues on in this interview, and he basically outlines what exactly he wants to see from the international community. So let's go ahead, and specifically from Joe Biden, so let's go ahead and listen to what he had to say on that front.
What would you like to hear, especially from the new Biden administration?
Well, you know, I think the myths of self-defense and both sides are growing more and more penetrable. People are being able to see through these myths and call an occupation for what it is and call an aggressor for what it is. And this is what we're going under, where we're facing in Sheikh Jarrah, in Jerusalem, in the Gaza Strip, in Lid, is colonial violence. And it's only allowed because both the state and the settlers know they have impunity. The settlers are emboldened by an apartheid state that allows them to open carry in Palestinian neighborhoods. And the state is emboldened by an international community that refuses to call it out for what it is, that allows it to intentionally target civilian neighborhoods in the Gaza Strip and massacre 24 Palestinians including 9 children, without facing any consequences. I don't expect much of the Biden administration. Knowing that Ned Price refused to even condemn the killing of 9 Palestinian children tells me all I need to know. Obviously, I would like the international community to hold Israel accountable under international law, but I also hope free people of the world do their part to push their governments.
So he said that. He also had this to say at the end, which I'll just finish it off here because this basically perfectly encapsulates the entire conversation.
Do you support the protests, the violent protests that have erupted in solidarity with you and other families in your position right now?
Do you support the violent dispossession of me and my family?
So, yeah, I mean, listen, that's perfectly right what he said there at the end, and I think that's a fair question to ask in rebuttal to that, because it's honestly a ridiculous question in the first place to ask, hey, do you approve of all of the violence that's being done in the name of your neighborhood to save it and stuff? And it's just a ridiculous question from the outset, because Israel is the aggressor in this situation. Israel are the ones who are displacing him and his family and their communities from their homes. They're using violent force to do so. And so nobody likes violence. Nobody wants there to be violence coming from any side. But if you're going to go out and condemn the violence from the protests, you should also be condemning the violence coming from the state of Israel, the government of Israel, and their security forces and illegal settlers that are going and displacing people from their homes. So it's an entire flipping of the frame of how this discussion needs to be had, right? Because again, typically throughout the history of this conflict, the U.S. media has come out firmly on one side and characterizes the entire situation as if it's Israel and then just a collection of terrorists who are attacking them, and Israel is just purely defending themselves. But as he pointed out there, Israel bombed a residential building in Gaza. They bombed a 13-story residential building, obliterated it, and in other bombings as well, they managed to kill upwards of 9 children. So regardless of what the situation is, even if you think that Gaza militants or Hamas deserve to be bombed, 9 children do not deserve to be bombed, period, in any context whatsoever, end of story. And so, you have a situation where there's an extreme discrepancy in power between the two sides. Israel is a nuclear-armed power backed by the largest and most powerful military in human history in the United States. And then you have Palestinians who in many cases are throwing rocks or throwing chairs or whatever they have around them in their immediate vicinity to defend themselves and their communities. And it's just a complete discrepancy of power in this situation. It's the same thing as getting mad at Native Americans for pushing back against American colonists when they were taking over the entire United States. I mean, it's clearly a one-sided issue, and if you're standing in the middle between them, then you have chosen the side of the oppressor. So in this context, there's no both sides that you can do in this situation, and so that's what he's asking from the Biden administration. That's what he's asking from the international community, and I don't think it's anything too radical to simply frame the discussion as it actually is, accurately on the ground, call out Israel for what they really are, and that is a violent settler, colonial, a fascist government, and we have to be able to recognize that. We have to be able to have those difficult conversations, and honestly, from what I've seen from Joe Biden so far and his administration, as Mohammed just pointed out in that clip, they are just waffling. They are just doing the both sides approach, if anything, coming more so on the side of Israel and saying, Hamas needs to be the ones to de-escalate. It's on them to stop the violence. And that's not going to get us anywhere. It's just not going to get us anywhere. You can't possibly say that Palestinian people who are being violently oppressed and attacked on a daily basis need to simply throw their arms up and give up the fight and cede all of this territory to the ever-expanding Israelis. So that's the situation that we have right now. I'm glad that this guy was actually able to go on mainstream media and present these arguments to a wider audience who might not hear some of the terms that he used, who might not typically hear this framing of the discussion, but it's super important nonetheless. And credit to him for having the bravery to go out and speak on this issue in that way.